We are told that the human body has hard limits: 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. These are the laws of biology, and they are supposed to be absolute. But the ocean does not care for our laws, and occasionally it produces an anomaly that defies everything we think we know about life and death. In 1942, a man named Poon Lim fell off the edge of the world. He was not a soldier, he was not a commander, and he was not an adventurer. He was a quiet steward who served tea to officers, a man designed to be invisible. But when his ship was erased by a German torpedo, he was left alone in the middle of the Atlantic with nothing but a wooden square and a pocket watch. What happened next was not a survival story. It was a transformation. For 133 days he drifted through a living hell. He fought sharks with his bare hands. He drank the blood of birds to stay hydrated. He engineered a life out of garbage while the sun tried to bake him and the sea tried to drown him. This is not a story about luck. It is a dark, psychological blueprint of what happens when a human mind refuses to break, even when the body has already begun to dissolve. It is the tale that forced the military to rewrite the manuals on human endurance. So, get comfortable and turn down the lights. We are going to drift into the void to answer the one question that terrified the doctors who found him. How far can a man go when tomorrow is optional, and survival is the only thing left? The ocean does not bargain. It does not negotiate, and it possesses no memory of the men it swallows. To the deep Atlantic, a human life is not a tragedy. It is merely biology, a momentary disruption of the surface tension that is quickly smoothed over by the wind and the waves. We like to believe that survival is a matter of strength, that the man with the largest muscles or the loudest voice is the one who endures. But the ocean proves us wrong. It strips away the pretense of strength and leaves only the raw architecture of the will. In the history of maritime disasters, there are stories of men who survived for days, perhaps a week, clinging to debris, praying for the smoke of a rescue ship. But there is one story that defies the logic of physiology and the limits of sanity. It is the story of a man who did not just survive the ocean. He entered into a long, brutal marriage with it. He did not just float. He hunted. He did not just wait to be saved. He engineered a life out of nothing but salt water and canvas. His name was Poon Lim. And before he became a legend, before he became a medical anomaly studied by the Royal Navy and the United States military, he was a ghost, a man no one noticed, a man who drifted for 133 days on a wooden square, fighting a war that no one else could see. To understand the magnitude of his ordeal, we must first understand the year, 1942. The world was burning, and the Atlantic Ocean had become a graveyard. This was the height of the Second World War, but in the shipping lanes it was known simply as the happy time for the German U-boat commanders. They patrolled the dark waters like wolves in a pen of sheep. The Allied supply lines, the veins carrying the blood of the war effort, were being slashed open, night after night. It was a war measured in tonnage. That is a cold word. Tonnage. It reduces ships, cargo, and human beings into a single calculable metric of loss. In 1942, the calculation was grim. Merchant ships were vanishing at a rate that terrified the Admiralty in London and the War Department in Washington. These were not warships plated in heavy armor, bristling with depth charges and radar. These were slow, rusting freighters, laden with oil, steel, and grain, chugging across the abyss at 10 knots, hoping that the vastness of the sea would hide them. Life aboard a British merchantman in those days was a study in claustrophobia and paranoia. Even in the middle of the ocean, thousands of miles from the nearest land, the war was suffocating. At night, the ships ran dark. No navigation lights, no cigarettes on deck. Even the glow of an open hatchway could betray a silhouette to a periscope watching from a mile away. The sailors lived in a perpetual state of suspended breath. They knew the statistics. They knew that if a torpedo struck, the water temperature in the North Atlantic or the South Atlantic could stop a human heart in minutes. If the explosion didn't kill you, the oil would choke you. If the oil didn't choke you, the cold would claim you. And if you survived all of that, you were left alone in a void so large that searching for a single lifeboat was like looking for a grain of sand in a desert. This was the world Poon Lim inhabited. He was 25 years old, born on the island of Hainan in China. He was a second steward aboard the SS Benlomond, a British merchant steamship. The title second steward sounds formal, almost important, but in the rigid, unspoken hierarchy of a 1940s merchant vessel, it meant he was part of the machinery, essential but invisible. He was the man who poured the tea, who made the beds, who ensured the officers were comfortable while they scanned the horizon for periscopes. There is a peculiar isolation that comes with being a foreign crewman on a colonial ship. You are there, but you are not, Akyof, there. Poon Lim spoke English, but he was not British. He lived in the spaces between the officers and the deckhands. He was quiet, diligent, and utterly professional. Those who knew him, or thought they knew him, saw a modest young man, perhaps a bit serious for his age. They saw his uniform, his steady hands, his polite nod. They did not see the iron. They did not know that this quiet steward possessed a mental fortitude that would soon shame the bravest soldiers on the front lines. His isolation aboard the ship was, in a strange way, a rehearsal. He was already accustomed to being alone in a room full of people. He was used to the routine, the silence, the discipline of service. He did not know it yet, but these were the very traits that would keep him alive when the world collapsed. The SS Benlomond was a heavy ship, armed with a slow engine and a single stern gun that was largely decorative against the technological terror of a German submarine. She was sailing alone. This was a gamble. Usually, ships traveled in convoys, surrounded by destroyers and corvettes. But the Benlomond was unescorted, crossing the South Atlantic on her way from Cape Town to Suriname and then on to New York. She was carrying ballast. She was sitting high in the water, a massive steel silhouette moving through the crushing darkness of the equator. November 23rd, 1942. The date is important. It marks the boundary between Poon Lim's life as a man and his life as a castaway. It was just past noon. The sun was high, beating down on the steel decks. The ocean was relatively calm, disguising its depth with a glittering hypnotic blue. Below the surface, however, something was moving. U-172, a German submarine commanded by Kapitän Leutnant Karl Emmermann, had been tracking the Benlomond. The attack was not a battle. It was an execution. There was no warning, no alarm bells ringing in advance, just a sudden, catastrophic impact. 2 torpedoes slammed into the Benlomond. The sound of a torpedo hitting a ship is not like thunder. It is a sharp, tearing crack, followed by a deep, guttural groan as the ship's spine is severed. The steel plates buckled. The rivets, thousands of them, popped like gunfire. The violence of the explosion was absolute. The ship didn't just leak, she disintegrated. The Benlomond was a heavy beast, but against the physics of high explosives, she was fragile. She began to sink immediately. And when a ship of that size goes down, she doesn't glide, she falls. Poon Lim was in his cabin when the world tilted. The floor became the wall. The air filled with the screaming of twisting metal and the hiss of escaping steam. The lights died instantly, plunging the interior into a terrifying, smoky blackness. He didn't think. He didn't pack a bag. Instinct, ancient and overriding, took the controls. He grabbed a life jacket, a primitive cork vest covered in canvas, and scrambled toward the deck. The scene on the deck was a vision of hell. The ship was listing heavily to the stern. Men were screaming, but their voices were swallowed by the roar of the water, rushing in to claim the vessel. There was no time to launch the lifeboats properly. The angle was too steep. The cables were jammed or snapped. The panic was total. Crewmen were jumping into the water, some without jackets, some already burning from the ruptured fuel tanks. Poon Lim made a decision. He did not jump randomly. He looked at the water. It was rising fast, coming up to meet the deck. He climbed over the rail. The ship was groaning, a death rattle of steel. He pushed himself off, jumping as far as he could to escape the suction of the sinking hull. He hit the water. It was warm, oily, and chaotic. He surfaced, gasping for air, choking on the taste of salt water and diesel. When he wiped the oil from his eyes and looked back, he saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The Benlomond, his home, the floating city of steel, was gone. It had taken 2 minutes, 120 seconds. That was all it took to erase a ship and a crew of 53 men. The ocean had simply opened its mouth and closed it again. Poon Lim was treading water in the center of a debris field. Broken crates, splintered wood, patches of thick, black oil. He could hear voices, cries for help, shouts of names, but the ship had gone down so fast that the suction had dragged many men under. The boilers exploded underwater, sending shockwaves through the sea that hit Poon Lim like a punch to the chest. He was alone. Or he thought he was alone. The voices faded quickly. The ocean is vast, and a head bobbing in the waves is invisible from 50 yards away. The silence that followed the sinking was heavy, almost physical. It was the silence of a library after a book has been dropped, an embarrassed, heavy stillness. He drifted. The cork life jacket kept his chin above the water, but the oil slick coated his skin, stinging his eyes, clogging his pores. He was in shock. His mind could not process the transition. 2 minutes ago, he was a steward preparing for the afternoon shift. Now he was a piece of flotsam. Hours passed. The sun began to dip. The terror of the night began to set in. In the water, you are not top of the food chain. You are bait. Poon Lim knew this. He kept his legs moving, trying to keep the blood flowing, trying to scan the horizon. And then, a miracle. Through the salt-crusted haze of his vision, he saw something bobbing in the distance. It wasn't a boat. It was a square, a wooden raft. It was an 8-foot by 8-foot box, drifting aimlessly. It was a Kali float, a standard piece of emergency equipment, essentially a wooden lattice floor surrounded by buoyancy tanks. He swam toward it. Every stroke was a battle against exhaustion. His clothes were heavy with water. The oil made everything slippery. When he finally reached the raft, he didn't have the strength to pull himself up gracefully. He clawed at the wood. He dragged his body over the rough edges, gasping, heaving, until he collapsed onto the wooden slats. He lay there for a long time, staring up at the sky. The wood was solid beneath him. It was dry, or dry enough. He was out of the water. He was alive. When he finally sat up, he looked around. The ocean was empty. The other survivors, if there were any, had drifted away or succumbed to the sea. He was the only one on the raft. He began to take inventory. This was the first act of his new life. He was no longer a steward. He was a master of logistics, and his warehouse was a wooden square 8 feet wide. The raft was equipped with survival tins. He cracked them open, his hands shaking. What he found was both a blessing and a curse. There were biscuits, hardtack, dry and dense. There was water, fresh water in metal canisters. There were some flares, a flashlight, a small bag of sugar. It was enough to keep a few men alive for a few days while they waited for a destroyer to crest the horizon. It was a kit designed for a short wait. It was not a kit designed for a voyage. Poon Lim did the math. He was a practical man. He looked at the water tins. He looked at the biscuits. He looked at the vast, empty horizon. He knew where the ship had gone down, somewhere in the mid-Atlantic gap, far from the coastal patrol routes. The U-boat was long gone. The Allies would not send a search party for a single ship in these waters. It was too dangerous. He realized then that he was not waiting for rescue. He was waiting to die. The only variable was how long he could delay it. The sun set on his first day. The darkness in the middle of the ocean is absolute. There is no light pollution, no glow from a distant city. The stars are bright, terrible eyes watching from above. The water turns black, indistinguishable from the sky. You are floating in a void. And then, the fear set in. Not the panic of the sinking, but the cold, creeping dread of the realization. He was a speck of dust on a mirror. Day turned to night and night turned to day. Poon Lim established a routine immediately. This is the first day arithmetic. Most men in his situation would eat. They would gorge themselves on the biscuits and gulp the water to soothe the burning in their throats, driven by the trauma of the event. But Poon Lim possessed a terrifying discipline. He looked at the water tins and calculated, if I drink this much, I live for 5 days. If I drink half, 10 days. If I simply wet my lips, how long? He tied a rope around his waist and secured it to the raft. This was his safety line. If a wave washed him off while he slept, he would not be left behind. He was securing his cargo. The cargo was himself. The first few days were a blur of physical recovery. He slept in short bursts. He watched the horizon until his eyes burned. He saw nothing. No smoke, no birds, just the rhythmic, endless undulating of the blue swells. But he was not alone. By the third or fourth day, the ocean decided to take attendance. It started with a shadow, a dark shape moving deep beneath the raft. At first, it looked like a cloud passing over the sun, casting a shade on the water. But the sky was clear. The shadow moved independently of the wind. Then, the fin broke the surface. It was a dorsal fin, jagged and grey, slicing through the water with zero effort. Then another. Then another. Sharks. They were not the monsters of cinema, roaring and charging. They were quieter, more efficient. They were inquisitive. They circled the raft, sensing the disturbance in their world. They could smell the oil, perhaps even the scent of the man. Poon Lim froze. He knew enough about the sea to know that splashing attracts predators. It mimics the distress of a dying fish. So he became a statue. He sat in the center of the raft, as far from the edges as possible. The sharks were patient. They nudged the raft. The wood shuddered. He could feel the sandpaper texture of their skin scraping against the bottom of his sanctuary. They were testing the durability of his world. They were asking a question: "Are you food?" He watched them. They were magnificent and terrifying. Their eyes were black voids. They moved with a serpentine grace that made his own clumsy human movements feel alien. For the first time, the reality of his position settled in. He was suspended on a wooden lattice, separated from a school of prehistoric killing machines by nothing more than a few inches of air. If the raft flipped, if the lashings broke, if he slipped, he did not panic. Panic burns calories. Panic wastes water. Panic is a luxury he could not afford. Instead, he watched. He studied the way they turned. He studied the time of day they appeared. He began to build a mental catalogue of his neighbors. This was the beginning of the grand ambition. It wasn't an ambition to conquer nations or build empires. It was the ambition to remain on the dry side of the wood. As the sun hammered down on him, blistering his skin, turning his thirst into a physical weight in his throat, Poon Lim made a silent pact with the ocean. He would not give in. He would not slide into the water and let the cold take him. He would play this game. He looked at the sharks circling the raft, their fins cutting geometric patterns in the water. "I am not your dinner," he whispered. His voice was raspy, dry as the biscuits in the tin. "Not today." The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and blood red. The temperature dropped. The sharks remained invisible now in the black water, but he could hear the splash of their tails, the subtle shifting of the liquid. He curled up in the center of the raft, the canvas pulled over his head to trap the moisture of his breath. He closed his eyes, but he did not sleep. He listened. He was one man. He had a few tins of biscuits, a few liters of water, and a flashlight that was slowly running out of power. Against him was the entire Atlantic Ocean, a pack of sharks, and the relentless grinding passage of time. The odds were statistically 0. But Poon Lim was done with statistics. He was done with being the man no one noticed. In the darkness of that vast, indifferent sea, he began to construct the architecture of his survival. He did not know it yet, but he was about to rewrite the manual on human endurance. The war measured in tonnage was happening thousands of miles away, but here, on this raft, a different war had begun. A war measured in drops of water, a war measured in the beats of a heart that refused to stop. The ocean had taken attendance, and Poon Lim had marked himself present. Survival is a system. It is not a singular act of heroism, like lifting a car off a trapped child or charging a machine gun nest. Those are moments of adrenaline, fueled by a biological override that shuts down pain and fear for a few seconds. But survival on the open ocean is different. It is a slow, grinding machinery. It is a bureaucracy of the body. You do not sprint, you audit, you do not fight. You negotiate with your own metabolism. By the end of the first week, the store-bought hope began to run out. The biscuits were turning into dust. The water tins, which had felt so heavy and reassuring at the start, were now light, hollow reminders of how little time remained. Poon Lim looked at his supplies and realized the British Navy had provided him with a kit designed to keep a man comfortable while he waited for a rescue that was already overdue. The kit assumed a civilized world where radios worked and ships came looking. But the civilized world was thousands of miles away, burning in the fires of war. Poon Lim was no longer a citizen of that world. He was a citizen of the raft, and the raft had no economy but the one he could build with his own hands. This is where the story shifts. Most men die here. They die not because they are weak, but because they cannot make the mental leap from passenger to engineer. They wait for the food to run out and then they starve, praying for a ship until their organs fail. Poon Lim, the second steward who had spent his life managing the comfort of others, now turned his meticulous nature inward. He stopped looking at the horizon and started looking at the trash in his pockets. He had a flashlight. It was dead, the batteries corroded by the salt air. To a normal eye, it was garbage. To Poon Lim, it was a mine of raw materials. He disassembled it with the reverence of a watchmaker. He removed the spring. He removed the metal casing. He looked at the wooden slats of the raft, the very floor he slept on, and saw not just wood, but hardware. He worked a nail loose from the timber, prying it out with his fingernails and the leverage of the biscuit tin, ignoring the bleeding of his own hands. Pain was just information. It told him the nail was coming loose. He hammered the nail into a hook, using the heavy water tin as a mallet. He unraveled the hemp rope that served as the raft's lifeline, teasing out the individual fibers, braiding them together to make a fishing line. It was tedious work. The sun beat down on the back of his neck, a relentless heavy heat that made the air shimmer. His fingers were swollen from the salt, his skin cracking like dry mud. But he kept braiding over and over, twist, pull, tighten, twist, pull, tighten. He was engineering a life, but a line and a hook are useless without bait. And here the ocean offered nothing. He had only the last crumbs of the hardtack biscuits. It was a gamble. To use the food he had, to catch the food he didn't. He took a pinch of biscuit, a tiny golden flake of carbohydrate, and molded it onto the crude hook. He lowered the line into the water. Fishing is usually described as a pastime of patience, but when you are starving, it is an act of torture. You are dangling your own survival into an abyss and hoping something stupid enough bites it. Poon Lim sat for hours. The sun moved across the sky, a slow, burning eye. The reflection off the water was blinding, searing his retinas. He couldn't wear sunglasses. He didn't have any. He just squinted, his face freezing into a permanent mask of concentration. He felt a tug, electric, immediate. The line went taut in his hand. He didn't yank it. The hemp was strong, but his knots were amateur. He pulled hand over hand, smooth, steady. The surface broke. A small fish, silver and thrashing, erupted from the blue. He hauled it onto the canvas. It flopped wildly, gasping in the alien air. Poon Lim didn't celebrate. He didn't cheer. He fell upon it. He grabbed the slippery, muscular body and ended it. He had no knife. He had made a blade from the metal of a biscuit tin, sharpening the edge against the rough wood of the raft, but it was jagged and crude. He cut the fish open. The smell of raw fish, of guts and blood, should have been repulsively strong in the clean sea air. To him, it smelled like life. He ate the organs first. He knew from some deep ancestral memory, or perhaps just the logic of the body, that the organs held the vitamins, the liver, the heart. He chewed the raw flesh. It was the first time in 10 days he had tasted protein. His stomach cramped, shocked by the sudden intake, but he forced it down. He saved the leftovers, the bones, the head, the guts he couldn't eat. This was not garbage. This was capital. This was bait for the next fish. But the blood on the raft changed the environment. The sharks knew. They had been circling before, curious, passive observers. Now they were interested. The scent of fish blood in the water is a dinner bell that rings for miles. They came closer. Their fins cut the water with more urgency. They began to bump the raft harder. Poon Lim realized he had entered a dangerous partnership. He was fishing for himself, but he was also chumming the water for the landlords of his new home. He had to be careful. When he gutted a fish, He learned to do it in the center of the raft, catching every drop of blood on the canvas, ensuring nothing spilled into the sea. He washed the blood off his hands with a rag, not in the ocean. He could not afford to smell like prey. He began to study the sharks with the intensity of a scientist. He recognized individuals. There was the large one with the scarred dorsal fin. There was the smaller, more erratic one that darted in close. They had shifts. They had patterns. They were not mindless monsters. They were clockwork animals, governed by the tides and the sun. He learned their rhythm. When the sharks were active, thrashing and feeding on schools of smaller fish passing by, he withdrew. He pulled his legs in. He sat perfectly still. When they settled into their lazy, gliding patrol, he worked. He became a creature of the gaps, living in the pauses of their aggression. Fear, he discovered, is a resource. If you use it all at once, you panic and die. If you ration it, it keeps you sharp. He turned his fear into vigilance. He slept in short, fitful bursts, waking at the slightest change in the sound of the water against the wood. A splash, a bump. He was awake instantly, his makeshift knife in hand. But food was only half the equation. The other half, the more desperate half, was water. The ocean is a cruel paradox. You are floating on hydration, surrounded by it, drowning in it, but you cannot drink it. The salt will kill you faster than the thirst. It shuts down the kidneys, sends the brain into hallucinations and stops the heart. Poon Lim's water tins were empty. He threw the last one into the corner of the raft. It clattered loudly, a hollow sound that emphasized his solitude. He looked at the sky. It was a brilliant, cloudless blue, beautiful to a vacationer, a death sentence to a castaway. He needed rain. He rigged the canvas awning of the raft. It was meant to provide shade, but he re-engineered it into a catch basin. He used the rope to create a depression in the center, a funnel that would guide water into his empty tins. He waited. Days passed. The thirst began to change him. His tongue swelled in his mouth until it felt too large to contain. His lips cracked and bled. His throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. He began to feel dizzy, a light floating sensation that was pleasant at first, then terrifying. He couldn't focus his eyes. And then the clouds gathered, heavy, dark bruises on the horizon, a squall. When the rain hit, it didn't start as a drizzle. It started as a deluge. The sound of rain on the ocean is a hiss, a white noise that drowns out everything else. Poon Lim scrambled. He didn't hide from the storm. He welcomed it. He stood naked in the rain, letting it wash the salt sores on his skin. He opened his mouth to the sky, drinking the falling water. It was sweet, pure, but he had work to do. He watched the canvas fill. The water pooling in the fabric was brown with grime and salt residue. He couldn't drink that yet. He had to let the rain wash the canvas clean. It was agonizing to watch the precious fresh water spill over the side, wasted, carrying the dirt away. But he had to wait. Finally, the water ran clear. He filled his tins. He filled the biscuit tin. He filled his belly until he vomited, and then he drank more. He was rich, in the economy of the raft. He was suddenly a millionaire. He had liters of water. He sat back as the storm passed, shivering, wet, but alive. He realized then that rain was gold. It was the only currency that mattered. With water and fish, a new danger emerged, the danger of hope. About a month into his drift, he saw it, a silhouette on the horizon. It was blocky, mechanical, a ship. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He scrambled to his feet, waving his shirt. He screamed, but his voice was a croak, lost in the wind. The ship was miles away, but it was getting closer. He could see the smoke from its stack. He could see the white foam of its bow wave. He grabbed the flares. He had saved them. He knew he only had a few. He fumbled with the mechanism, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He popped the flare. Red smoke hissed into the air. It was vibrant, an artificial color that stood out violently against the blue sky. It drifted up, a desperate flag. They have to see me. I am right here. The ship kept moving. It didn't turn. It didn't slow down. It plowed through the waves, indifferent, blind. Poon Lim lit another flare, and another. He burned his treasury of signals in 5 minutes. The ship passed. It grew smaller. The smoke dissipated. The white wake faded into the general chaos of the waves. The silence that followed was heavier than anything he had ever felt. It was a physical weight. He collapsed onto the wood. The despair was not a sadness, it was a physical blow. He felt foolish. He felt small. He realized that to the crew of that ship, looking through binoculars, he was nothing. A piece of driftwood, a trick of the light. Or perhaps they had seen him. Perhaps they thought he was a decoy. U-boats were known to use life rafts as bait, luring merchant ships in to stop for a survivor, only to put a torpedo in their hull when they slowed down. In the paranoia of 1942, compassion was a fatal weakness. They might have seen a man dying and decided that saving him was a tactical error. He would never know. That night was the hardest. The sharks bumped the raft, and for the first time, he considered letting them in. He considered sliding into the water and ending the thirst, the heat, the constant grinding work of staying alive. Why fight so hard for a world that wouldn't even turn its head to look at you? But the sun rose. It always does. And with the sun, the routine returned. Poon Lim realized that hope was dangerous. Hope was a drug that gave you a high and then crashed you into a depression. He decided to stop hoping for rescue. He would not live for the ship on the horizon. He would live for the fish under the raft. Routine became his religion. He woke up. He checked the knots. He checked the canvas. He checked the water levels. He fished. He ate. He cleaned. He slept. He began to talk to himself. Not the mutterings of a madman, but the structured dialogue of a lonely man. He narrated his actions. Now I am tying the knot. Now I am cleaning the knife. Now I am drinking 1 swallow of water. He needed to hear a human voice, even if it was his own. He needed to impose order on the chaos. The ocean is formless. It changes shape every second. The mind needs straight lines. It needs cause and effect. He marked the days by cutting notches into the wood of the raft. 1 notch, 1 day. The notches grew into a tally, a row of soldiers marching across the timber. 40 days, 50 days. He was drifting into the unknown. The currents were taking him west, away from Africa, toward the vast empty center of the Atlantic. He was entering the doldrums, the dead zones where the wind dies, and the sea becomes a mirror. His body was changing. The fat was gone. The muscle was dissolving. He was becoming wiry, hard, like a piece of dried leather. His skin was burnt black by the sun, peeling and reburning until it toughened into a hide. He looked less like a British steward and more like a part of the raft itself, a wooden figurehead carved by the wind. But his mind remained sharp. He did not let the hallucinations take over yet. He fought them with math. He fought them with the inventory. I have 3 tins of water. I have 2 dried fish strips. I have 1 hook. He was a shopkeeper in hell, meticulously counting his stock while the demons circled outside. He noticed the sharks were getting bolder. They sensed the change in him. They sensed he was getting lighter, weaker. One large shark, a beast he called the Patriarch, began to circle closer, its fin cutting the water just inches from the raft. It bumped the wood hard enough to lift the corner. Poon Lim looked at the shark. He didn't feel fear anymore. He felt a strange, cold anger. "You want the raft?" he said to the water. "Come and take it." He was no longer just surviving. He was digging in. The ocean had tried to drown him. The sun had tried to bake him. The ships had ignored him. And now the sharks wanted to evict him. He gripped his crude knife. He checked his line. He took a sip of water. He was Poon Lim, the man no one noticed, and he was going to make the ocean notice him. The routine had saved his mind, but the test was far from over. As the days blurred into weeks, the true enemy was no longer hunger or thirst. It was the crushing weight of time. The silence was becoming a roar, and in the distance the storms were gathering, not of rain, but of madness. Act 2 was closing. The systems were in place, the machine was running, but machines break, and the human mind is the most fragile machine of all. The ocean does not merely attack the body, it besieges the mind. Hunger is a sharp pain, a cramp that twists the stomach and consumes the fat, but madness is a fog. It rolls in slowly, obscuring the horizon between what is real and what is memory. After 2 months on the raft, the silence of the Atlantic became louder than the storms. It was a silence that demanded to be filled, and when there was no sound to fill it, Poon Lim's brain began to manufacture its own. This is the phase of survival that manuals cannot teach. You can learn how to distill water. You can learn how to knot a line. But there is no diagram for how to stop your own mind from turning against you. It started with the voices. At first, they were whispers in the wind, indistinct, like a radio left on in another room. He would turn his head, sharp and sudden, convinced that someone had spoken his name. Limcher Lim. He would look at the empty wooden bench opposite him, expecting to see a crewmate. He saw faces in the grain of the wood. He saw the captain of the Benlomond standing on the waves, checking his watch, shaking his head in disappointment. Then the hallucinations became structural. He didn't just hear voices, he saw land. He would wake up from a sun-dazed nap and see the coast of China rising from the water. He saw the familiar streets of Hainan. He saw noodle stalls, steam rising from the pots, the smell of star anise and pork fat so real his mouth watered, filling with saliva he could not spare. He saw his family. They were waving to him, calling him to swim over, to just step off the raft and walk across the water because it wasn't water anymore, it was a paved road. This is the siren song of the deep. It is the brain trying to protect itself from the trauma of isolation by building a better reality. But in the middle of the ocean, that better reality is a trap. If he stepped off the raft to walk on that road, he would drown. Poon Lim realized his mind was leaking. He was losing the coordinates of the present. The terror of this was sharper than the sharks. If he went mad, he would die. He would make a mistake. He would forget to tie the rope. He would drink the seawater. He needed an anchor. He needed a way to tether his consciousness to the wooden square. He began to count. He counted everything. He counted the rivets on the water tank. He counted the fibers in the rope. He counted the waves. 1, 2, 3, 4. He forced himself to recite the inventory of the raft aloud, shouting the numbers into the wind to drown out the phantom voices. 1 tin, 2 tins, the knife is here. The canvas is dry. He rebuilt his reality through cataloguing. He imposed a rigid mathematical order on his day. He forbade himself from looking at the horizon for too long, because the horizon was where the ghosts lived. He looked down. He looked at his hands. He looked at the work. He made a decision then, a quiet covenant with the void. He would not live for the rescue. He would not live for the future. He would live for the next hour. To project too far ahead was to invite despair. If he thought about drifting for another month, the weight of it would crush him. But he could survive 1 hour and then another. This philosophical shift, from waiting to enduring, saved his sanity. But the ocean, sensing that his mind had fortified itself, decided to assault his body with a violence he had not yet seen. The sky turned a color that did not belong in nature. It was not gray and it was not black. It was a bruised, sickly green. The air pressure dropped so fast his ears popped. The wind died, leaving a vacuum of silence that felt heavy, like the breathless moment before a car crash. Then the water began to boil. The storm that hit him was not a squall. It was a weather system, a chaotic engine of destruction. The waves grew from hills into mountains, 40 feet high, moving walls of water that blocked out the sky. When the raft rose to the crest of a wave, Poon Lim could see for miles, a churning, white-capped hellscape. When it dropped into the trough, he was buried in a canyon of water, the light extinguished, the roar of the ocean deafening. He did not try to steer. He did not try to fish. He tied everything down. He took the precious water tins, the knife, the few strips of dried fish, and he lashed them to the raft's frame with a strength born of panic. Then he lashed himself. He tied the rope around his waist, checking the knot 3 times, 4 times. The first massive wave broke directly over the raft. It didn't wash over him. It hammered him. Tons of water slammed down, driving the raft underwater. For a terrifying 10 seconds he was submerged. He held his breath, his eyes squeezed shut, his hands gripping the wooden slats so hard his fingernails tore. He felt the raft twisting, fighting to flip over. If it flipped, he would be trapped underneath, or the gear would be ripped away. He kicked. He fought the buoyancy, The raft shuddered and popped back to the surface like a cork. He gasped for air, coughing up brine, but before he could clear his lungs, the next wave hit. This went on for hours, or maybe days. In a storm, time ceases to exist. There is only the rhythm of the drowning. Up, breathe, down, hold, up, breathe, down, hold. The temperature plummeted. The tropical heat was replaced by a bone-chilling cold that seeped into his marrow. He was soaked, shivering so violently, his teeth chattered a rhythm against the roar of the wind. Hypothermia began to set in. His movements became sluggish. His thoughts slowed down like a clock winding down. He thought about untying the rope. It would be so warm in the water. Just let go, just sleep. But the machine inside him, the survival instinct that had been honed over months of starvation, refused to shut down. He forced himself to move. He slapped his own face. He flexed his frozen fingers. He screamed at the storm. He cursed the waves in English, in Cantonese, in every language he knew. He made himself angry, because anger is heat, anger is fuel. When the storm finally broke, it didn't end gracefully. It simply exhausted itself, leaving behind a heaving, confused sea and a sky the color of lead. Poon Lim lay on the wet canvas, more dead than alive. He was bruised all over. His skin was bleached white and wrinkled from the immersion. He turned his head to check the inventory. The water tins were there. The knife was there. But the water in his reservoir, the fresh rain he had painstakingly collected, was contaminated. Seawater had washed into his open catchment. He tasted it. Salt. He had survived the violence, but at a cost. He was back to zero. Thirsty. Exhausted. And the storm had pushed him miles off whatever course he had been drifting on. Now, the true wasting began. The human body is a battery. When it cannot draw energy from food, it consumes itself. It starts with the fat reserves. Poon Lim had lost those weeks ago. Now the body turned on the muscles. It metabolized his biceps, his thighs, the muscles of his back. He watched himself disappear. His clothes, once a snug steward's uniform, now hung off him like rags on a scarecrow. He had to use rope to tie his trousers up, gathering fistfuls of fabric at the waist. His ribs were not just visible, they were prominent ridges, sharp enough to bruise his skin when he lay down on the hard wood. His joints, knees, elbows, shoulders bulged out, grotesque knobs on stick-like limbs. He was too weak to stand. Standing required a balance and a core strength he no longer possessed. He began to crawl around the raft. He moved like an insect, sliding on his belly, conserving every calorie. His hair grew long and matted, crusted with salt. His fingernails were long and curled. He looked wild, a feral creature of the sea. But inside that skeletal frame, the mind was still calculating. Calories in, calories out, fluid loss, sun exposure. He realized that his perception of time had dissolved completely. He didn't know if it had been 80 days or 100. The notches on the wood were just a texture now. The calendar of the civilized world had no authority here. A Sunday was the same as a Tuesday. There were only two times, day and night, life and death. And then the birds came. It started with a speck in the sky, not a cloud. A wing. Poon Lim squinted against the glare. It was a seabird, a tern, a gull. He didn't know the species, but he knew the significance. Birds do not live in the deep ocean. They need land to nest. They need shallow waters to fish. If there were birds, there was land. Maybe not close, but closer than before. The bird circled the raft. It saw the wooden platform as a resting place, a floating island in a weary world. It didn't see the predator lying flat against the canvas. Poon Lim froze. He stopped breathing. He became wood. The bird landed on the edge of the raft. It folded its wings, preening its feathers, looking out at the water with a casual arrogance. Poon Lim waited. His heart was hammering against the wooden deck, surely loud enough to vibrate through the planks, but the bird stayed. He needed to move, but he was so weak. His muscles trembled with the effort of stillness. He watched the bird hop closer. It was curious. It looked at his foot. It pecked at the canvas. He waited until it was within arm's reach. He didn't lunge. He didn't have the speed for a lunge. He simply let his hand fall. It was a trap springing shut. His skeletal fingers closed around the bird's leg. The explosion of noise was instant. The bird shrieked, flapping its wings, pecking wildly at his arm. Beak met skin, tearing flesh, drawing blood. Poon Lim didn't feel it. He dragged the bird toward him. He got his other hand around its neck. He twisted. The bird went limp. He sat up, panting, holding the warm bundle of feathers. It was small, hardly a mouthful of meat. But to him it was a feast. He didn't cook it. He didn't have fire. He stripped the feathers, the down sticking to his wet, sticky hands. He tore into the meat with his teeth. It was tough, stringy, and tasted of fish and iron. But the most important part was the blood. He drank it. Bird blood is not salty like seawater. It is hydration. It is life. He drank the warm, metallic fluid, feeling it hit his stomach like a shot of adrenaline. He ate everything. The heart, the liver, the eyes. He crunched the small hollow bones to suck out the marrow. He was a man who had once served tea on silver platters to officers in crisp white uniforms. Now he was covered in blood and feathers, consuming a raw bird on a rotting raft. He had descended the ladder of civilization to the very bottom rung, and there he found the strength to keep climbing. The bird was not just food, it was a sign. He looked at the water. For months the Atlantic had been a deep, dark indigo, the color of the abyss. But now, as he drifted, the color was shifting. It was subtle at first, a lightness in the blue, then hints of green. The water was changing. The taste of the spray was different. It was still salty, but less aggressive. The air smelled different. It didn't smell like pure ozone and salt anymore. It smelled of earth, rotting vegetation, mud. He didn't know it, but he was drifting into the outflow of the Amazon River. The greatest river on earth pushes a plume of fresh water and sediment hundreds of miles out into the Atlantic. He was entering the River Sea. He crawled to the edge of the raft and looked down. Small things were floating in the water, not ocean debris. Twigs, leaves, a piece of bamboo. Poon Lim wept. He didn't cry out of sadness. He didn't cry out of joy. He wept because his reality was breaking again. The green water meant the end of the void. It meant that the world of men, of solid ground, of dirt and trees, was reaching out to catch him. But he was so tired. The bird had given him a burst of energy, but the tank was empty. He lay back on the canvas, watching the clouds. They were different too. They were cumulus clouds, the kind that build over heated land masses. He drifted. The current here was gentle, pushing him steadily southwest. He was a ghost ship sailing toward a continent. He closed his eyes. He imagined the land. He didn't imagine a hero's welcome. He imagined the feeling of not moving. He imagined a surface that didn't pitch and roll. He imagined lying on the grass and never ever getting up again. But the ocean has a final cruelty. To see the land is one thing, to reach it is another. The surf, the rocks, the currents that sweep along the coast, these are the final guards at the gate. Poon Lim was a skeleton on a box, drifting toward a coast he didn't know, into a world that had likely forgotten his name. He had won the battle against the sharks. He had won the battle against the storm. He had won the battle against his own mind. But now he had to survive the rescue. The green water lapped against the wood, a softer sound than the deep ocean swell. It whispered to him, almost, almost. He gripped the side of the raft. He would not die now. He would not die within sight of the leaves. He sharpened his knife again, a reflex of the routine. He checked the knots. He was ready for the end. Whatever it was, the crisis of the mind had passed. The crisis of the body was at its peak, and on the horizon, a thin brown line appeared. It wasn't a hallucination. It was Brazil. The final act was about to begin, and Poon Lim, the man who had become a manual of survival, was about to face the hardest question of all. Can a man who has become a creature of the ocean ever truly return to the land? The end of the world did not come with a bang. It came with the sound of a voice that was not his own. On April 5th, 1943, the silence was broken. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the sharks. It was the hum of a human conversation. Poon Lim raised his head. He was drifting 3 miles off the coast of Brazil. The water here was brown, thick with the silt of the Amazon. He saw a small vessel, a fishing boat with a simple sail. On board were 3 men. They were not soldiers. They were not sailors of the Great War. They were simple fishermen, harvesting the sea that had tried to kill him for 133 days. He waved his shirt. He did not scream. He had no voice left. He simply stood up. That action, standing up, was his final act of defiance. By all medical logic, he should have been comatose. His muscles had atrophied, his joints were locked, but he forced his legs to straighten. He wanted to be found on his feet. The fishermen steered toward the strange wooden square. They saw a man who looked like a spectre, hair down to his shoulders, skin the color of old mahogany, naked except for the tattered remains of a uniform tied with rope. They pulled him aboard. They offered him water, they offered him food. He took the water, but he looked back at the raft. Before they sailed away, he gestured to the wooden box that had been his home, his prison and his savior. He wanted to bring it with him. He wanted the evidence. But the fishermen, superstitious or perhaps just practical, left it drifting. The raft, having served its purpose, was returned to the ocean. Poon Lim landed in Belém. He did not walk ashore like a conquering hero. He was carried. The gravity of the earth felt crushing after months of weightlessness. The solid ground, which he had craved for 4 months, felt wrong. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. It felt dead beneath his feet. He was taken to a hospital. The doctors who examined him were prepared to write a death certificate. They expected a man in the final stages of starvation, with organ failure, scurvy, and severe psychosis. What they found was a medical impossibility. He had lost 20 pounds, that was all. His blood count was stable. His mind was clear. He was weak, yes, but he was not broken. He asked for a haircut. He asked for a toothbrush. He apologized for his appearance. The doctors were baffled. They asked him how he had survived. They asked about the water, the food, the madness. He told them about the bird blood. He told them about the shark liver. He told them about the counting. He was discharged from the hospital quickly. Too quickly, perhaps. The British consul arranged for his transport to the United Kingdom and then to the United States. The war was still on. The machine needed its parts back. But Poon Lim was no longer just a part. He was data. The Royal Navy took his story and dissected it. They didn't just want to know that he survived. They needed to know how. His ordeal became a blueprint. Because of Poon Lim, the survival manuals were rewritten. They learned that fresh fish contained enough liquid to sustain life if the lymph fluid was consumed. They learned that seawater could be used to cool the body, but never to hydrate it. They learned that the mind could be anchored by routine. Life rafts were redesigned. Survival kits were updated to include better fishing tackle, better shades, better instructions. Thousands of sailors who were torpedoed in the final years of the war and in the decades that followed survived because a steward from Hainan had figured out the math of eternity first. He saved them, but they would never know his name. And this is where the tragedy of the legacy begins. Poon Lim was awarded the British Empire Medal. King George VI pinned it to his chest. It is a high honor, a recognition of meritorious service. But fame is a fickle currency. Poon Lim was not a general. He was not a pilot ace. He was a Chinese steward in a world dominated by Western powers. The newspapers ran his picture, calling him the Chinese Iron Man, but the headlines faded. The war ended. The world wanted to forget the torpedoes and the sinking ships. It wanted to dance. Poon Lim drifted again, this time on land. He tried to join the US Navy but was rejected for flat feet, a cruel irony for a man who had stood on a rolling raft for 4 months. He eventually gained American citizenship, not through standard immigration, but through a special bill introduced in the Senate, a recognition that a man who beats the Atlantic deserves to pick his home. He settled in Brooklyn. He disappeared into the machinery of peace. He became a steward again, this time on cruise liners and later at a hotel. He poured tea. He made beds. He served men who had never known a day of true hunger in their lives. Those who worked with him said he was quiet. He didn't talk about the sharks. He didn't talk about the thirst. He went to work, he did his job, and he went home. He lived a life of aggressive normalcy. It was as if he was trying to prove that he could be ordinary again. But the ocean never leaves you. Survival experts and psychologists have studied his case for 80 years. They compare him to others. They look at the Robertson family, who survived 38 days. They look at Stephen Callahan, 76 days. They look at Jose Salvador Alvarenga, who drifted for over a year in 2012. But Poon Lim remains the benchmark for solitary, active survival on a raft in that era. Why him? Why did the steward survive when the captain died? Why did the man with no training beat the commandos? The answer lies in the final philosophical verdict. We assume that hope is the engine of survival. We are taught that you must believe you will be rescued. But Poon Lim proved the opposite. Hope is a liability, hope makes you wait, and waiting kills you. Poon Lim survived because he stopped waiting. He stopped expecting the world to save him. He accepted the raft as his universe. He accepted the shark as his neighbor. He accepted the rain as his salary. He built a life where there was no life. He realized that the line between the living and the dead is not drawn by God or by fate. It is drawn by the daily decision to drink the blood of a bird. It is drawn by the refusal to close your eyes when the storm hits. Poon Lim died in 1991 in Brooklyn, an old man in a warm bed. But in a way, he never left the Atlantic. A part of him remained on that wooden square, counting the waves, watching the fin cut the water, proving to the universe that a human being is not just a biological accident, but a creature of terrifying, beautiful will. If you ever find yourself on the open ocean, alone in the blue, do not look for a ship. Do not look for the coast. Look at your hands. Look at the trash in your pockets. That is all you have. And if you are like Poon Lim, it is all you need. The ocean is vast. It is indifferent. It is cruel. But it can be beaten. Not by strength, not by luck, but by the simple, brutal arithmetic of enduring one more minute than the sea expects. This is the story of the man who fought the sharks and won. But the prize was not a medal. The prize was simply tomorrow.